Marissa Harris, a 32-year-old mother of one, boarded her red-eye flight from Atlanta to Seattle with her 8-year-old son, Miles, eager to attend an important business meeting the following day. As a hardworking single mother and a successful entrepreneur, Marissa was accustomed to the challenges that came with balancing both her career and personal life. This flight was her chance to unwind, catch some much-needed rest, and prepare mentally for her next steps. Upon reaching her seat in first class, she was taken aback when she found a man already occupying it. This was not just any man, this was an entitled, smug figure who seemed to believe that his presence in her seat was unquestionable. The man, Nathaniel Peterson, was seated comfortably in her assigned space, clearly ignoring the fact that the seat had already been booked and paid for. Marissa, somewhat surprised by the situation, took a deep breath and calmly approached him. "Excuse me," Marissa began, keeping her tone polite yet firm. "This is my seat." Nathaniel barely glanced up from his phone. His response was dismissive, and his attitude suggested that Marissa's presence in the first-class cabin was inconvenient for him. "Oh, I've been upgraded," he said, not even bothering to make eye contact with her. His tone was smug and self-assured, as if his mere word should be enough to invalidate Marissa's claim to the seat. Marissa, standing her ground, was determined not to let this go easily. "I don't think you've been upgraded. I paid for this seat, and I'm assigned here. I need you to move," she said, emphasizing her right to the space. However, Nathaniel was unmoved. He leaned back in his seat, clearly intent on making it clear that he was not about to relinquish the space he had claimed. "I've been upgraded," he repeated, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You'll have to find another seat. I'm not moving." Marissa's frustration grew, but she remained calm. She had been a fighter her entire life, facing challenges and obstacles without ever backing down. This situation, she realized, wasn't just about a seat, it was a test of respect, fairness, and the entitlement that some people seemed to think was their birthright. Nathaniel, with his expensive suit and dismissive attitude, clearly had no intention of considering Marissa's perspective as a paying customer. As the moments dragged on, the tension began to rise. Marissa could feel the eyes of the surrounding passengers on her, many of whom were now silently observing the conflict unfolding. But it wasn't just about her fight for a seat, it was a fight for dignity and the right to be treated with respect. Marissa called for a flight attendant, hoping that someone would step in to mediate the situation. She had hoped that the crew would be trained to handle these types of disputes, but the response she received from Evelyn Pierce, the flight attendant who arrived at the scene, was less than encouraging. Evelyn, rather than offering any support to Marissa, immediately sided with Nathaniel. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice flat and unhelpful. She then turned to Marissa with an almost dismissive look, as if she were the one creating the disruption. "I'm just trying to sit in my seat," Marissa explained, her voice tinged with frustration. "This man is in my assigned seat, and he refuses to move." Evelyn barely acknowledged Marissa's explanation, instead glancing at Nathaniel before responding. "There's been a system glitch," she said, offering a flimsy excuse for Nathaniel's behavior. "He's been upgraded, so the seat is his now." Marissa's heart sank. The more she listened to Evelyn's dismissive tone, the more it became clear to her that her rights as a paying customer didn't matter in this situation. She had already paid for the seat, and she had done everything by the book. Yet, here she was, fighting not only for her seat but for the respect that she deserved. The flight attendant's failure to acknowledge her situation was not just an inconvenience, it was an insult. This was more than just a trivial seat dispute, it was an illustration of how people in positions of power often disregard the needs and rights of others, especially when they believe they have the privilege to do so. Marissa's frustration mounted, and as she stood there, it became clear that the issue wasn't just about the seat, it was about entitlement, bias, and the way people like Nathaniel and Evelyn treated her based solely on assumptions. As she prepared to escalate the issue, Marissa knew that the confrontation was far from over. This would not be the last time she would have to fight for respect, and she was ready to make her voice heard. Marissa's heart pounded as she reached for her phone, deciding to begin recording the situation. She had spent her life building a successful business, always working twice as hard to prove herself in a world that often dismissed people like her. This flight was supposed to be a reprieve from the constant battles, but now, it seemed as though she was once again in the thick of an unjust situation. With a steady hand, she began the live stream, knowing that the world would be watching. She wasn't about to let Nathaniel or Evelyn's behavior slide. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about ensuring that her story, and the stories of others who had been overlooked or dismissed, were heard. "Hey, everyone," Marissa said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm on a flight from Atlanta to Seattle, and I've just been denied my seat in first class. This man, Nathaniel Peterson, has taken my seat, and now, the flight attendants are backing him up, saying there's a system glitch. I paid for this seat, and I'm asking for help." As Marissa continued to speak, the comments started flooding in. Her followers, many of whom knew her as an advocate for fairness, quickly expressed their support. Messages like, "This is ridiculous," and "Stand your ground, Marissa," filled the screen. The support she received from strangers gave her strength. What was initially a private conflict had now grown into a public demonstration of how far entitlement could go when unchecked. Nathaniel, visibly uncomfortable with the growing attention, started to shift uncomfortably in his seat. "What is this, some kind of public spectacle?" he sneered, clearly annoyed that anyone would challenge his presumed authority. "You're making a scene over nothing. Just find another seat." But Marissa wasn't backing down. "I paid for this seat, Nathaniel. It's not just about the seat anymore, it's about respect and fairness. You don't get to take something that isn't yours because you think you can. And Evelyn, you're supposed to be here to help, not to dismiss me." Evelyn's face flushed as the comments and calls for action grew louder in the cabin. She glanced around nervously, noticing more and more passengers paying attention. It was becoming clear that her initial decision to side with Nathaniel was not going unnoticed. A few rows back, a man named Ryan, who had been silently watching the exchange, decided to speak up. "This is wrong," he said, his voice carrying over to the flight attendants. "I saw her board first class. She has every right to that seat. This isn't fair." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Some passengers were now openly supporting Marissa, while others seemed hesitant to get involved. But Marissa stood her ground, refusing to let Nathaniel's entitlement dictate her experience. With each passing moment, her resolve grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for anyone who had been silenced or dismissed in situations like this. As Ryan continued to record, his live stream began to pick up significant traction. The camera captured the injustice of the moment, and the people watching from home started to take notice. More and more viewers tuned in, expressing outrage and solidarity with Marissa. It became evident that this situation was far from ordinary. What had started as a simple seating dispute was quickly escalating into something much larger, a call for justice, accountability, and respect. As Marissa continued to speak out, she felt a sense of empowerment. This wasn't just her battle anymore, it was everyone's fight. The air in the cabin was thick with tension as Marissa continued to stand her ground. The situation, initially just about reclaiming her seat, had escalated into something far more significant. It wasn't just about her physical space in first class, it was about respect and dignity, something she had fought for her entire life. Nathaniel Peterson's refusal to move and Evelyn Pierce's blatant disregard for Marissa's rights had now become an emblem of everything that was wrong with how power was wielded, especially when it came to people like Marissa, hardworking, intelligent, and black. The live stream had continued to capture every moment, and as more viewers tuned in, the growing support for Marissa became impossible to ignore. The comments were pouring in, "This is outrageous. Why isn't anyone helping her? She deserves that seat." The collective outrage was palpable, and it only served to intensify Marissa's resolve. The more she spoke, the stronger she felt. She wasn't just a passenger anymore, she was a voice calling for change, a symbol of resistance against corporate entitlement and prejudice. Evelyn, flustered by the mounting attention, kept shifting uncomfortably on her feet. "Ma'am," she said, trying to regain some semblance of control, "we can't keep this up. You need to calm down." Marissa's eyes locked onto Evelyn's, unwavering. "I'm calm. What I'm not is silent. You think you can push me around because you think I don't belong in this seat? Well, I'm here to tell you that I do. And you've got no right to treat me this way." At that moment, a few other passengers, who had been silent observers up until then, began to speak up. "She's right," a middle-aged woman from a few rows back called out. "Why should he get special treatment?" Another passenger, a man in his 50s who had been quietly watching the exchange, stood up and addressed Evelyn directly. "You're supposed to be here to help us. Why are you supporting him?" His words were firm but respectful. "It's clear she's the one in the right." Evelyn, already visibly rattled by the unexpected shift in the room's atmosphere, glanced nervously at the other flight attendants. Paul, who had been standing further down the aisle, approached the situation slowly, unsure of how to handle the growing number of passengers voicing their support for Marissa. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to leave the seat," Paul said with an authoritative edge to his voice. "We'll move you to another section if necessary." Marissa shook her head, not willing to back down. "I'm not leaving. I paid for this seat. You have no right to force me out, and you need to stop protecting him just because he's a man in a suit. You don't get to treat people like this, Evelyn." The tension in the cabin continued to build. Some passengers who had been quietly observing now began to gather in small groups, murmuring to one another about the unfairness of the situation. Marissa could feel her pulse quicken, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. This wasn't just a matter of one person's bad behavior, it was a representation of something much larger, the way powerful individuals could manipulate systems to their advantage, while ordinary people like her were made to feel invisible. Marissa could sense that the flight attendants were trying to move toward a resolution, but Evelyn's obstinance had made the situation worse. "You don't need to make a scene," Evelyn said, trying to calm things down. "Just move to another seat and we'll sort this out once we're in the air." "No," Marissa replied sharply, her voice firm with a sense of justice. "This isn't something you can just brush under the rug. It's not just about this seat, it's about what happens when you let people like Nathaniel walk all over others. It's about fairness. I'm not going to let you treat me like this." The room was now divided. On one side were the passengers who quietly supported Marissa, while on the other side were those who were uncomfortable with the public scene but didn't want to speak out. The dynamic had shifted, and it was no longer just a battle for a seat, it was a battle for respect, for dignity, and for justice. As Marissa continued to challenge Evelyn, she saw the tension building in Nathaniel's face. He had gone from smug indifference to visible discomfort. He had not expected this level of resistance. He had thought that his wealth and status would be enough to push her aside, but Marissa wasn't backing down. The more Marissa spoke, the more Nathaniel's facade cracked. "What are you even trying to prove?" Nathaniel sneered, clearly trying to deflect attention away from his actions. "You're making this into a bigger deal than it is." Marissa stood taller, refusing to let his words shake her. "What I'm proving, Nathaniel, is that I'm not going to let you or anyone else push me around. I belong here just as much as you do. And just because you think you're entitled to something doesn't mean I have to take it lying down." At that moment, a voice from further back in the cabin interrupted, catching Marissa off guard. It was Ryan, the passenger who had been filming the entire incident. "Hey, this isn't right," Ryan said, his phone still recording. "This lady's been more than patient, and now you're treating her like she doesn't belong here. This is unfair, and it's time for you to do your job, Evelyn. I'm documenting this, and it's going to go viral if you don't fix this now." Evelyn looked at Ryan, clearly nervous as the situation grew more intense. She had hoped for a quiet resolution, but now that her actions were under scrutiny, she seemed unsure of how to proceed. As Ryan's phone continued to record, the rest of the passengers took notice, some beginning to nod in agreement with Marissa's stance. The growing public support was a powerful force. Marissa felt a wave of solidarity wash over her, but there was also an underlying sense of urgency. She knew that the longer this went on, the harder it would be to resolve, but she wasn't going to let herself be silenced or intimidated. This was her moment to stand up for what was right. "You're right, Ryan," Marissa said, her voice clear and resolute. "This isn't just about the seat. This is about making sure that people like Nathaniel, who think they can walk all over others, understand that it's not okay." The situation had shifted. Marissa was no longer just a passenger, she was now a voice for everyone who had ever been made to feel lesser because of their status, race, or position in society. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane, it was a call for equality, for fairness, and for justice in a world that often favored the privileged. With the situation continuing to unfold, Marissa could see that the momentum was on her side. The conflict wasn't over, but the tables had turned. The question now was whether Evelyn and Nathaniel would be able to ignore the mounting pressure from the passengers and the viral momentum that was pushing for accountability. As the scene unfolded, Marissa knew one thing for sure: she would not back down, and she would not let the injustice go unnoticed. The battle was just beginning, and Marissa was ready for the fight ahead. Marissa's heart pounded as the tension on the plane escalated. She had stood her ground for what felt like hours now, and the constant pushback from Evelyn Pierce and Nathaniel Peterson was beginning to take its toll. What started as a simple disagreement over a seat had turned into a nightmare, an ordeal that seemed designed not just to humiliate her but to punish her for daring to challenge their entitlement. But Marissa wasn't backing down. She knew she had to fight, not just for herself, but for her son, Miles, who was watching the entire ordeal unfold. The passengers who had been silently observing began to murmur amongst themselves. Some were now actively engaging, expressing their support for Marissa and her fight for fairness. Others seemed uncomfortable, unsure of how to intervene. Marissa could feel their stares, and though it was a small source of comfort to know others were on her side, it also reminded her of just how alone she felt in the face of this systemic disregard for her rights. Evelyn's indifference continued to fuel the fire. Her dismissive attitude toward Marissa's requests had already been clear, but now she was growing more visibly irritated by the attention Marissa's live stream was drawing. "Ma'am," Evelyn said, trying to maintain a professional tone, though it was beginning to crack, "you really need to stop making a scene. The other passengers are getting uncomfortable." But it wasn't Marissa who had caused the scene. It was Nathaniel's arrogance, Evelyn's refusal to listen, and a blatant disregard for Marissa's paid seat. Still, Marissa didn't respond. She remained composed, focusing on the bigger picture, the principles she was fighting for. Miles, who had been quiet until now, was clinging to her side, sensing his mother's frustration but also her unwavering strength. Then, something happened that would change everything. As the confrontation seemed to be reaching its boiling point, Evelyn, who had been walking down the aisle toward the galley, suddenly stopped and turned back around. Without warning, she swung a hot cup of coffee from the cart directly onto Miles' lap. The shock on Marissa's face was immediate, followed by the sharp scream from Miles. "Mom! It burns," he cried, his tiny hands frantically trying to brush off the hot liquid, but it was too late. The coffee had soaked through his pants, leaving deep, angry red burns on his legs. Miles was sobbing, and Marissa could see the tears welling up in his eyes. But the worst part, the part that shook her to the core, was that it was intentional. Evelyn had deliberately thrown that coffee, her eyes flashing with an emotion that could only be described as malice. "Evelyn!" Marissa shouted, rushing to her son's side. "What is wrong with you? You did that on purpose." Evelyn didn't answer. Instead, she just stood there, her face expressionless, as if she didn't care about the pain she had just caused. Marissa, a nurse by profession, immediately took control of the situation, ignoring the burning rage in her chest. She gently took Miles into her arms and tried to assess the extent of the burns, knowing how serious this could be. She searched her bag for something to help, but the lack of proper medical supplies only made the situation worse. She did her best to calm Miles, who was still crying and shaking in her arms. "Mom, it hurts," Miles whimpered, his small voice breaking her heart. Marissa did her best to comfort him, speaking softly. "I know, baby. It's going to be okay. We'll get you some help, I promise." Her mind was racing. How could Evelyn have done this? She had always known that people could act out of malice, but never in her worst nightmares had she imagined a flight attendant, someone who was supposed to ensure the safety and comfort of passengers, could intentionally harm a child. But that was exactly what had happened. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just negligence, this was cruelty. As Marissa tended to Miles, she looked up and saw the other passengers watching in stunned silence. Many were shocked, others were murmuring in disbelief, but none of them moved to help. Ryan, who had been recording the entire incident, was still filming, his face grim as he watched Marissa try to care for her son. "Are you all right?" Ryan asked, his voice strained. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. This is unbelievable. I just need to get him to a doctor," Marissa said, her voice tight with emotion. This was deliberate. She did this on purpose. Evelyn, who had been watching from a distance, didn't speak. She simply turned around and walked back toward the galley, as if the situation didn't concern her. Marissa couldn't believe her audacity. Evelyn had just assaulted her son and yet showed no remorse, no empathy, not even a hint of guilt. Marissa was seething, but she focused on Miles. As a nurse, she knew the immediate steps she needed to take for burn care. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. Marissa had been fighting for her rights as a paying customer, but this was something entirely different, something far more personal. This wasn't just a matter of a seat dispute anymore. It was about ensuring that Miles was okay and that Evelyn faced the consequences for her actions. The flight attendants seemed unsure of how to respond. They could clearly see that things had gone too far, but none of them took any real steps to rectify the situation. Marissa could see that their hesitance to intervene was tied to their desire to protect the reputation of the airline, which had clearly sided with Nathaniel and ignored the wrongdoing that was right in front of them. Ryan, who had been filming the entire encounter, came forward with a concerned look on his face. "Marissa, I'm still recording. This needs to be documented. I can send this out to the press when we land. We need to make sure people know what happened here." Marissa nodded, her mind now focused on getting Miles the care he needed. "Thank you, Ryan. I'm going to make sure this gets out. No one should ever have to go through this." The rest of the flight felt like an eternity. Marissa's focus remained entirely on Miles, her thoughts clouded by the injustice of what had just happened. She had no idea how the airline would respond when the plane landed, but one thing was certain, she was not going to let this go. She would make sure that Evelyn faced consequences for her actions, and she would make sure that this story was told, no matter what it took. As the plane began its descent into Boise, Marissa knew that the real battle was only just beginning. She wasn't just fighting for a seat on a plane anymore, she was fighting for justice, for accountability, and for the dignity of her son. The plane landed with a jolt, but the relief of finally reaching their destination was overshadowed by the chaos that was unfolding in the cabin. Marissa, still holding Miles in her arms, was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained from the fight she had just endured. The pain from the burns on Miles' legs was clear in the way he clung to her, and Marissa knew they needed medical attention immediately. But before she could even make a move toward the exit, the flight crew was already on high alert. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that law enforcement would be meeting the flight due to a serious incident. Marissa felt a pit form in her stomach. She knew what this meant, they were coming to arrest her. It didn't take long for two uniformed officers to board the plane and begin moving down the aisle. Marissa was still holding Miles, who was now quiet, resting his head against her shoulder, his small body exhausted from the ordeal. Marissa stood up to face the officers, her heart racing. She had done nothing wrong, but she could already feel the weight of the false accusations bearing down on her. One of the officers approached her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," he said in a stern voice. "You're being detained due to an assault claim made by a fellow passenger." Marissa's blood ran cold. "What?" she gasped, her voice trembling with shock and disbelief. "An assault? By who?" "By Mr. Peterson," the officer replied, gesturing toward Nathaniel, who was now standing by the front of the cabin. His face was a picture of righteous indignation, and Marissa could see the smirk on his face as he watched her being detained. "I never touched him," Marissa exclaimed, her voice shaking with anger and confusion. "This is all a lie. He's the one who stole my seat, and Evelyn splashed coffee on my son." But the officers didn't listen to her. Instead, they simply instructed her to follow them. The idea that they would listen to Nathaniel's baseless accusations while completely ignoring the evidence that was now in the hands of Ryan, who had been filming the entire incident, was infuriating. But Marissa was too stunned to react at first. The officers' presence, the chaos of the moment, the way they treated her as the criminal, it was all too much. As Marissa was escorted off the plane, her mind raced with thoughts of how this had all gone wrong. She had fought for her seat, for respect, for fairness, but instead, she was being treated like a criminal. Nathaniel and Evelyn were standing by, and it was clear that they thought they had won. But Marissa knew the truth. This wasn't over. The fight for justice was just beginning, and she would make sure that Nathaniel, Evelyn, and the airline paid for what they had done. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about standing up to a system that allowed people to abuse their power, to harm others, and to walk away unscathed. As the officers led her off the plane, Marissa knew that the coming days would be full of challenges. But she was ready for them. With her son by her side and her determination stronger than ever, she would make sure that the truth came out. And she would fight for justice, no matter the cost. The sound of Marissa's footsteps echoed as she was escorted through the terminal by the police officers. The sharp, crisp air of the Boise airport seemed to hit her in waves as they led her to a secluded area, her heart pounding with each step. She felt her entire body tense, the adrenaline from the chaotic situation still coursing through her veins. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being treated as the criminal, the one at fault. The unfairness of it all was suffocating. Marissa's mind raced as she was ushered into a small, sterile room. The fluorescent lights above hummed, casting a cold, harsh light over her. Her son, Miles, who had been quietly crying in her arms, now lay in her lap, exhausted from the emotional and physical toll the day had taken on him. She gently stroked his hair, her own frustration mounting with each passing second. "Ma'am, please stay here while we finalize the details of the report," one of the officers said as he closed the door behind him. Marissa sat in silence, trying to gather her thoughts. She had just been assaulted, and now she was being detained for defending her son and herself. She couldn't shake the image of Evelyn's cold face, the way she had splashed hot coffee on Miles intentionally, and the complete lack of remorse. Her stomach churned as she replayed the moment over and over in her head. The sound of her phone buzzing in her bag interrupted her thoughts. It was Ryan, the man who had been recording the incident on the flight. She quickly fumbled with the phone, her fingers trembling as she answered. "Marissa, are you okay?" Ryan's voice crackled through the speaker, his concern evident. "I've got everything on video. I'm going to make sure this gets out. You're not alone in this." Marissa closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words wash over her. She was grateful for the support, but she knew that this battle was only beginning. "Thank you, Ryan. I can't believe this is happening," she said, her voice breaking as she tried to hold it together. "But I won't back down. They can't just get away with this." Ryan's voice grew firmer. I've already sent the footage to some contacts in the media. People need to see what happened. They need to know about Evelyn and Nathaniel's behavior. A wave of relief washed over Marissa as she realized that the truth was now in the hands of others. The injustice that had been done to her, the deliberate cruelty toward her son, would not be hidden. She would make sure of it. The door to the small room opened suddenly, and a different officer stepped inside, his expression neutral but stern. "Ms. Harris, we need to speak with you about the charges that have been brought against you." Marissa stood, her anger simmering just below the surface. "Charges?" she repeated, incredulous. "What charges? I've done nothing wrong." The officer nodded, his tone unchanged. "There have been claims of assault from Mr. Peterson. We have to take them seriously. We're going to need you to cooperate with the investigation." Marissa's breath caught in her throat as the officer's words settled in. Nathaniel had falsely accused her of assault. After everything she had been through, after what Evelyn had done to her son, they were going to make her the villain. "Let me make something clear," Marissa said, her voice low and fierce. "I did not assault anyone. I was defending my son and myself from an unjust situation. Nathaniel and Evelyn are the ones who should be held accountable. They're the ones who need to be investigated, not me." The officer didn't respond immediately, but his face softened just a fraction, as if he was finally beginning to see her side of things. Still, he didn't budge. "We'll need you to answer some questions, Ms. Harris," he said, his voice less stern now. "But rest assured, the evidence will be reviewed. We'll make sure this is handled properly." Marissa nodded, though a part of her wasn't sure if she believed that things would be handled properly. She had seen how easily Nathaniel's privilege had allowed him to manipulate the situation, and now she feared that the system would continue to protect him. But she wasn't about to let it happen. She would fight back, no matter how long it took. As the investigation into the incident continued, the live stream Ryan had recorded went viral. Marissa's story spread like wildfire across social media platforms, with people everywhere condemning the actions of Evelyn and Nathaniel. News outlets picked up the footage, and public outrage grew by the minute. The video showed everything: Evelyn's malicious behavior toward Marissa and her son, the moment the hot coffee was thrown, and Nathaniel's dismissive attitude as he tried to deflect blame onto Marissa. It was impossible to ignore the evidence, and the online community rallied behind Marissa, demanding justice. The hashtags #Justice for Marissa and #EndRacism quickly gained traction, flooding social media with stories of discrimination and injustice. People shared their own experiences of being mistreated, of being ignored, or worse, of being wrongfully accused because of their race. Marissa's fight had become a movement. The airline, realizing that the situation had gone far beyond their control, issued a statement condemning the actions of the flight crew and promising an internal investigation. But Marissa knew better than to trust their words. She had seen how easily they had dismissed her, how quickly they had sided with Nathaniel. This wasn't about an apology, this was about accountability. Public figures began to speak out in Marissa's defense, including civil rights activists, community leaders, and even celebrities who had seen the footage and shared their outrage. It became clear that this wasn't just about a bad experience on a plane, it was about the larger issues of systemic racism and how those with privilege could manipulate situations to their advantage. Marissa, though still reeling from the emotional toll, began to take calls from reporters and journalists eager to cover her story. She spoke passionately about the injustices she had faced, the harm done to her son, and the need for real change within institutions like the airline industry. She was no longer just a victim of a biased system, she had become a voice for the voiceless. But even as the public rallied behind her, Marissa knew that the fight wasn't over. The authorities had not yet dropped the charges, and Nathaniel and Evelyn had not been held accountable. She wasn't going to stop until they faced the consequences of their actions. She was determined to make sure this story didn't fade into the background. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. And as the pressure continued to mount on the airline, Marissa knew that they had no choice but to listen. The police arrived in Boise and quickly began to process Marissa, despite her innocence being clear to everyone who had witnessed the incident. She was still reeling from the pain of seeing her son hurt, the humiliation of being falsely accused, and the overwhelming emotions of being detained for a crime she didn't commit. But she wasn't about to let them break her spirit. As Marissa was led away from the gate, she could hear the murmurs of passengers and bystanders. Some were sympathetic, others unsure of what to believe. But Marissa knew the truth, and soon, the world would too. Ryan had sent the footage to news outlets, and as the story spread, the pressure on the authorities to act fairly grew stronger. When Marissa arrived at the police station, she was interrogated about the alleged assault. It was a grueling process, questions about her actions, her demeanor, and her role in the incident. But with the support of her legal team and the growing public outcry, Marissa was confident that the truth would come to light. The authorities could try to silence her, but the evidence was overwhelming. Meanwhile, Nathaniel and Evelyn's lies were slowly being exposed. As the story gained traction, other passengers who had been on the flight began to come forward, confirming Marissa's version of events. The pressure on the airline to take responsibility for their staff's actions was building, and the public was demanding justice. But as the police continued to process Marissa, something even more unsettling happened. Nathaniel and Evelyn, the two individuals responsible for starting this entire nightmare, had quietly slipped away. The authorities had failed to apprehend them, and it seemed like they were going to avoid any consequences for their behavior. Marissa was left to face the legal system alone, with no guarantee that those responsible would be held accountable. Despite the mounting pressure, the situation seemed hopeless. Nathaniel and Evelyn had managed to escape without facing the consequences of their actions. But Marissa wasn't done yet. She would continue to fight, even if it meant facing an uphill battle. She had already shown the world her strength, and now she would ensure that the fight for justice didn't end with her. Marissa's victory, bittersweet as it was, proved to be just the beginning. As her legal team prepared to file a lawsuit against the airline, her voice grew louder. The public, now fully aware of what had happened to her and her son, rallied behind her. There was no way the airline could continue to hide from the truth. But Marissa's victory came at a cost. She discovered that her ally, Gloria, whom she had trusted, had betrayed her. Gloria had stolen funds that Marissa had raised for her legal defense and disappeared without a trace. The betrayal stung deeply, but Marissa refused to let it break her. As the legal battle continued, Marissa became a symbol of resistance, of standing up for what was right in the face of adversity. She knew that the fight for justice wasn't over, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. The airline eventually capitulated, settling the lawsuit and agreeing to overhaul their policies. Marissa's fight had exposed the deep-rooted systemic issues within the company and beyond. But the road ahead was long, and Marissa knew that her work was far from done. The world was watching, and she would not rest until true change was achieved.